All right, so today I'm going to talk to you guys about the history of streetwear. Now, I did a video in the past, about 3-4 years ago when I first started this channel, and it was understanding, the history of streetwear. And it's one of my most viewed videos with about 26,000 views. And in that video, I really talk about how streetwear got started and how hip hop was a huge influence to it, as well as skate. But there's something to that story that I kind of left out and realized it later. And it's one of the reasons why I really wanted to make this video, to kind of tie up loose ends and tell you about this other half of the story. So let's discuss how streetwear got started next here on Making the Brand. What's up, everybody? Rob Norman here from Planet Brooklyn Academy, and this is Making the Brand Season 2, series where I give you a little insider knowledge on how to start a clothing brand, and if you already have one, how to make it better. As always, please hit that like and subscribe button, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you can stay up to date with everything I drop when it drops. Okay, so story time. Let's talk about streetwear. So as I said at the top of the video, I made this video about 3 years ago talking about the history of streetwear. But recently I was having a conversation with some friends from the industry, and we were just talking about, life, with fashion and how things have changed so much, and about what we wore back in the days. And as many of you who have been following me since I started this channel, I'm born and raised in Brooklyn. I was there when streetwear started. I was there when hip hop fashion started. Growing up here, I saw all those things. I was in the music industry. I was in the fashion industry. I was a skater. I saw all this stuff. So I've had my foot deeply rooted into, the history of urban fashion, streetwear, and all that stuff. But in the video that I told you back then, I talked a lot about hip hop fashion. And I talked about the legacies and all the legacy brands that came up to really help start streetwear. But here's the thing. The one part of the story that I left out for you is probably the most important part of the story. So there is one brand that really started everything in streetwear. And most of you already know this if you know your history of, fashion, especially East Coast, West Coast, and where, streetwear started. You will know that streetwear was started back in the 80s. Now, it started in the 80s, not in the 90s, and definitely did not start in the 2000s. In the 2000s is when it became mainstream, and everybody started using the word, streetwear, streetwear, streetwear. But it was actually in the 80s that streetwear was born. And it started with Sean Stussy, the brand that we all know, Stussy. Now, Stussy was a West Coast brand. And the thing is that people go, well, yes, today we know Stussy to be, the foundation to streetwear, but how was it the foundation? Now, if you know the history of Stussy and Sean Stussy, you know that it started out on the West Coast. Now, Stussy was a surfer. Sean Stussy was a surfer, and his brand was part of that California culture, surf and skate. And it was becoming very big out there. And what happened was he started to introduce his brands to other places outside of the US. And this is where this backstory comes in that I talked about, where as I was talking about hip hop and how hip hop was influencing and starting to influence streetwear, it was actually Sean Stussy that was making this happen behind the scenes. Now, how is this happening behind the scenes? Well, back in the 80s, problem is that back then, there was no internet. So everything we relied on for information was from magazines and things like that. If you lived in New York and you saw somebody in a magazine wearing something in California, it was like you lived in Europe, or you lived in Japan and you were trying to get clothes from Japan to the US. It was the same thing if you lived on the East Coast and you saw something on the West Coast and you wanted it. It was like two different ends of the world. So many times I, being a skater, could look at Thrasher magazine or any of the big skateboard magazines at the time, and I saw certain things in those magazines that I saw kids wearing. And a lot of stuff they were wearing were Stussy. And I saw these things and I was like, oh, I want that brand. I want to get Stussy. And, the average kid living here on the East Coast who wasn't a skater wasn't privy to the idea of what Stussy was. But I was a skater growing up in the 80s. In the mid to late 80s, I was skating. So I was aware of brands like Vision, who were the first ones to do streetwear on their clothing, Vision Streetwear. If you look it up, if you're not familiar with Vision Streetwear, they were a major skateboard company back in the 80s. And one of the things about it, one of the first skaters they had was Mark Gonzalez. And Mark Gonzalez was from the East Coast, and he moved to the West Coast. And his first board, professional skateboard, was on Vision. And Vision started a whole thing called Vision Streetwear. So I'm wearing Vision Streetwear t-shirts back in like 85, 86. So I was already privy to the idea of what streetwear was, but the majority of people on the East Coast were strictly into hip hop. They weren't skating. Skating was not a big thing on the East Coast, at least not yet. In the mid 80s, it started to become a big thing because kids were now being influenced from watching music videos and seeing MTV, and you're seeing kids skating. And skating started to get big on the East Coast. Now, in the late 80s, there was a decline in skateboarding on the West Coast. So people weren't doing it as much, people weren't sponsoring it. But here on the East Coast, we were picking it up. And being that we're on the East Coast and we're more of an urban city, we didn't have half pipes to skate on and things like that. We just had the city. So street skating really kind of was birthed in the East Coast, especially New York. So we're skating, but at the same time, as we're skating, we also kind of wanted to have that West Coast appeal because we're being influenced by it, because the magazines are showing skater clothes and stuff that they wear on the West Coast. But you're not seeing those things on the East Coast. You're only seeing them in the mags, and you can only get them at specific stores. So as being an East Coast skater, we are still influenced by hip hop. So we're wearing hip hop clothing, but we're also skating. And we're mixing some of those clothing that we're seeing from the West Coast that we're able to get. We're wearing it. Now, how does Sean Stussy comes into this whole story? Well, during this period when skating was in the decline and Stussy was selling, what Sean Stussy started to do was, he wasn't just selling his product on the West Coast. He started selling it in Europe and in Japan. So they started getting his fashions, where on the West Coast, on the East Coast, I'm sorry, we weren't getting it until there was a store called Union. And Union was down on Spring Street, I think it was Spring or Prince Street, down in Soho. I would go down there, and because they always carried products that you couldn't normally get. They got a lot of East Coast brands or European brands that you can get. And Stussy was one of those brands that Union was carrying. Now, if you know the story of Union, you know that James Jebbia, the founder of Supreme, started Union. So when he had Union, he started carrying some Stussy stuff because he really loved Stussy. So he started carrying their stuff in there. So this is where a lot of skaters were able to get it, because now that we knew that there was a store here that carried it, we were able to go down there and now purchase Stussy gear. And Stussy was also being sold in like Bloomingdale's, but the real exclusive stuff we know was down at Union. Now, as this is coming into those stores, hip hop is now becoming really big with its fashion. So the Fubus, the Meccas, the Nietzsche's, all becoming very huge, and it's becoming mainstream. But while these mainstream brands are blowing up, underground is streetwear is happening. And as I said, you know, Stussy is big overseas, and you're starting to see it overseas. And now Japanese brands are starting to be influenced by that, and they're starting to design brands similar to it. And then you started having East Coast brands that was also being influenced underground, who are part of the skate market and part of that graffiti market and the underground hip hop market, starting to wear these local brands or these brands that they thought were more creative. And this is where you start to get the bubbling of streetwear underground. So as I said, in the 90s, in the late 80s into the 90s, while everything was these big urban brands, underneath it was all these streetwear brands being built. Now, there's a magazine, if you can look it up, called Street and Sport. Now, it was a trade magazine. So your regular magazines back then you paid maybe $5 for. Sport and Street was a magazine that you paid like $25, $30 for, and it only came out quarterly, so basically seasonally. And in this book, you can see all different brands from Japan, Europe, and you're looking at their dressing styling. And a lot of stuff that we see in streetwear now, they were doing back then, and it was in this magazine, but it was hard to get a hold of this magazine. You had to know where to go, and mostly fashion stores that carried fashion magazines, they would carry these books. Back then, we used to go to Tower Records. And Tower Records was where we used to buy our music, but there was also Tower Books that was always next door to it or behind it. And in there, you can actually get this book. So I would go there all the time to look at this book and flip through it. And this is during the time I was just starting my line, and I was getting influenced by these magazines. Now, brands that started to being developed like these on the East Coast, you started having brands like P&B Nation was heavily influenced by the streetwear culture. Futura 2000 you had. Then you had European brands like Fresh Jive, Extra Large. Extra Large was a great brand, and if you know about Extra Large as well, Mike D from the Beastie Boys was one of the founding members of Extra Large. But Extra Large was now another brand that had a very streetwear appeal underground. You had other ones like Pervert, Con Art, all those brands. If you can think of any, please, in the comment section below, name some of the brands that you remember that were streetwear brands back in the late 80s, early 90s that were underground, that weren't the mainstream ones, but brands like I'm just naming right now. Please list them down below. I'd love to hear some of the names. It'll bring back great memories. But even Diesel Jeans. Diesel Jeans had a streetwear brand back then. It's called 55 DSL. And I still have a t-shirt from them from back then. But they used to have a store in their Diesel stores towards the back of the store. It'd be like a little door and you go in there and it'd be a whole room, which was kind of their streetwear stuff. And it was this 55 DSL brand. So it was big because overseas, you had all these brands doing it. Also in Japan, you had Neighborhood and Bounty Hunter was another one that was big out there. So all these brands are doing streetwear, but the rest of the world is not, aware of this. And Stussy started the Stussy Tribe. And what he was doing was going around the world and giving jackets to influencers. Now, doesn't this sound familiar today? You're talking about 80s and 90s when there's no internet, there's no e-commerce, all right, there's no social media. What Stussy was doing was he was going around and giving out jackets. These were member-only varsity jackets. And it would have the person's name on it and it would say Stussy Tribe. And in each one of these cities around the world, these are people who were influential. They were DJs, they were artists, they were skaters, they were DJs. They all wore these jackets. And it was just promoting the brand. So whenever you saw this, you knew like, okay, this person is into Stussy, but this person is also somebody who, is into music or they're an artist. So it just showed how, widespreading that Stussy was. They weren't about one thing. They were about a whole lot of different things. So you also had hip hop artists wearing it. So Stussy, as I said, through the side channels, was building this whole streetwear community outside of the US and within the US underground. So by the time we get into the 90s, and you're noticing that, that urban fashion is huge, and at the same time, parallel to that, streetwear is going. And when we hit like the early 2000s, as we started to see urban brands start to tick down, streetwear is starting to emerge because it's becoming bigger globally. So then in 2005, 2006 is when suddenly mainstream America goes, oh, streetwear, because they saw Crooks and Castles. Jay-Z wore Crooks and Castles, and suddenly that was the explosion of streetwear. But again, streetwear had already been around for more than 15 years. It's just the rest of the world didn't know about it. So once we saw that, that's when streetwear becomes main, and now everybody else starts to, realize it. So this is kind of the backstory that I left out when I told you the first time about streetwear and its history. It's really, Stussy that started all this. It started by going outside of the US and promoting it to other countries and getting them involved. And they started to create brands. And then the US brands started to create, these underground lines that everybody's wearing. And this is what happens in fashion most of the time, that whatever's the main fashion trend currently, there's always a subculture version happening somewhere that's going to be the next thing to take off. So you should be looking now, if you're curious to know what the next trend is, you should be seeing what is trending. And I can tell you right now, one of the things that's trending is gaming and fashion and gaming. That has been bubbling underground for years. And now it's starting to come up. And mark my words, that will probably be the next biggest thing. So if you're looking for a new market to get in, start considering that. Start looking at where gaming is going. Look at the history of gaming and what clothing has been created in that, what's been created outside of the US. Because now the world is so much smaller with the internet, you can now see where things have started, where things are growing to. But I kind of just wanted to share with you guys that story of how, Sean Stussy helped create streetwear that we know today, and how, him doing the behind the scenes work really cultivated a whole movement that happened globally with everybody. And it was just great product being turned out. And at the end of the day, here we are. So I hope that was helpful for you guys. Again, this was a redux to my original video from 3 years ago. And I hope you guys enjoyed that. If you have any questions, please, as always, leave them down in the comment section below. And till the next time, I'll catch you guys later. Peace.